It didn't begin with a meeting, or a phone call, or even a negotiation. It began with a number, whispered in corridors where engines are usually louder than doubt. 12.5 million. Not shouted, not announced, but placed carefully on the table like a weight whose mass no one wanted to calculate out loud. Inside Borgo Panigale, the air changed before anyone spoke. Because this wasn't just a salary request. It was a question aimed straight at Ducati's identity. Marc Márquez had just delivered the ultimate proof of excellence, a world championship carved for precision, pain, and control, and now he was asking for something far more dangerous than money: recognition. Recognition that the victories did not come from carbon fiber alone. Recognition that the bike, for once, followed the rider. If I am the difference, why am I treated like a variable? Marquez wondered, fully aware that this thought could fracture everything he had just built. Ducati had spent years preaching a single gospel. The machine is the star, the rider is replaceable. But numbers have a way of exposing truths philosophy can no longer protect. 12.5 million euros doesn't buy speed. It buys acknowledgement. And that is what made the request so unsettling. Because if Ducati says yes, they abandon a belief forged over decades. If they say no, they risk losing the man who made their machine look immortal. Somewhere between pride and fear, a silence settled in. And in that silence, a simple question began to echo. What happens when the star refuses to stay in the shadow? Ducati's 2025 championship should have been a moment of corporate calm, a clean horizon after years of technical obsession. Yet inside Borgo Panigale, it landed like an unexpected echo that refused to fade. Marc Márquez delivered the title with surgical consistency, masking weaknesses, bending physics, and rewriting expectations that Ducati engineers believed were already perfected. In the boardroom, spreadsheets showed dominance, but in the garages, unease crept in because the victories did not follow the script Ducati had spent a decade enforcing. For years, the doctrine was clear. The bike is the star, the rider is the interpreter, and no individual must ever eclipse the machine. Marquez shattered that balance quietly, not with declarations, but by riding the GP25 faster than its data suggested was possible. A little-known technical detail haunted the engineers. Marquez consistently ran a modified engine braking map that reduced rear-wheel locking at corner entry, a compromise others refused because it destabilized mid-corner load transfer. Watching the telemetry, Ducati insiders realized he was correcting the bike's flaws like a pianist compensating for a warped key. I'm winning, but I'm alone up here, Marquez thought, feeling the weight of success press harder than defeat ever had. Publicly, Ducati celebrated harmony, but privately the dominance created an uncomfortable asymmetry of power. One senior engineer admitted off record, when Marc wins like this, the bike stops being the hero, a sentence that spread through the factory like a low-frequency vibration. The title exposed a paradox. Ducati had built the most complete machine on the grid, yet it was Marquez who completed it. This realization inverted years of philosophy, forcing management to confront the idea that control had slipped from carbon fiber to human instinct. The atmosphere shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like a perfectly tuned orchestra suddenly following a single soloist instead of the conductor. Sponsors smiled, trophies gleamed, but internal meetings grew longer and quieter. Marquez felt it too. The silence behind the applause, the knowledge that leverage had moved without anyone signing a document. His dominance was no longer just sporting excellence. It was strategic pressure. Ducati won everything that mattered on track, yet lost the certainty that had defined its modern era. In that contradiction, power changed hands. The championship trophy became a mirror, reflecting truths Ducati had avoided for years. And in the stillness after victory, the project began to slip from certainty into suspense. The numbers hit like an avalanche, slow at first, but then cascading with terrifying certainty. The leaked figure wasn't just a salary request, it was a declaration of power. 12 to 15 million euros per season, possibly more with bonuses. The sum wasn't just high. It was a message that reverberated through Ducati's foundation, rattling both boardrooms and paddocks. Marc Márquez had started 2025 with a quiet confidence, having restored Ducati's name to the very peak of MotoGP, but now he was demanding the acknowledgement that came with being the architect of that success. A fraction of his former Honda earnings, just 3 million euros a year, had felt like a symbolic return to the humble roots of his career. But that was before the world saw the Marquez who had redefined limits. This was no longer a man trying to rebuild his reputation, but rather someone who had reshaped an entire narrative. I didn't just win titles this year. I made Ducati the story, he thought, feeling the cold sting of a reality he could no longer ignore. Ducati had always prided itself on a philosophy of machine supremacy. The rider was important, of course, but the factory's engineering prowess was always supposed to be the focus. But as the season unfolded, that doctrine began to crumble. Ducati's engineers had built a world-beating bike, but it was Marquez who had brought it to life, squeezing every ounce of potential from the GP25 with a style uniquely his own. A little-known technical detail had revealed just how far Marquez had pushed the GP25 beyond its design limits. His aggressive throttle modulation during braking zones had been so precise, it nearly defied engineering logic, allowing him to retain tire grip and manage cornering forces in ways others couldn't. "I'm worth more than €3 million a year," he muttered to himself. Much more. And so his demand wasn't about greed. It was about justice, an assertion that the rider could no longer remain invisible in Ducati's high-performance formula. Ducati, for all its accolades, had been caught in the trap of its own philosophy. The brand had long resisted the idea of a rider demanding superstar status, but now that the spotlight had shifted from machine to man, the old rules seemed irrelevant. Team members whispered in hushed tones, unsure of how to respond. Ducati's pay structure had never been flexible enough to accommodate such a demand. Marc knew this, but also knew that Ducati's commitment to winning would ultimately force them to bend. As he reviewed the leaked reports, one thought echoed through his mind: "I'm worth every penny." Ducati now faced a dilemma: honor their engineering legacy or embrace the new era, where the rider was the cornerstone of success. The request, in some ways, was an existential choice for the team. Accept the changing tides of the sport, or remain anchored to the past, letting the current of market realities drag them under. But the true weight of the moment came when the figures on the table weren't just numbers. They were catalysts for change, a profound shift in the identity of the sport itself. Will Ducati meet the demand, or will Marquez's legacy be written elsewhere? The balance between machine and man had irrevocably tipped, and only one side could win. The next few days would define whether Ducati was prepared to live in this new reality, or whether the championship they had fought so hard for would slip through their fingers like sand. The moment negotiations froze did not come with slammed doors or raised voices, but of the calm pause that unsettled Ducati far more than any argument could have. Inside Borgo Panigale, executives expected tension, counteroffers, and compromise, yet instead they were met with silence, deliberate and controlled. Marc Márquez did not walk away from the table in anger. He simply chose not to sit down again. The decision was technical, precise, and brutally rational. After the GP25's regression forced engineers to revert to an older combustion concept mid-season, Marquez needed proof, not promises. A little-known detail sharpened his caution. The GP25's crankshaft inertia had been altered to improve acceleration, but compromised rear stability under extreme lean, something only Marquez consistently managed. Watching that flaw resurface, he understood how thin the margin truly was. I won despite the bike, not because of it, he admitted silently, replaying corner entries in his mind long after the engines cooled. For Ducati, loyalty had always been currency, but Marquez now dealt in performance guarantees. "The GP26 will tell me everything," he reportedly told a confidant, a sentence that landed like a verdict rather than a threat. Behind closed doors, engineers scrambled, knowing that the next engine architecture would not just define lap times, but careers. Marquez wasn't testing patience, he was testing competence. He moved through the paddock like a man examining the foundations of a house before deciding whether to live inside it. The pause exposed a reversal of power, subtle yet irreversible. Ducati needed certainty. Marquez needed evidence. Brand prestige, past victories, even championships faded in importance compared to torque curves, combustion stability, and long-run tire behavior. The silence grew louder with every week that passed. Negotiations hadn't failed, they were being audited. In choosing to wait, Marquez transformed time into leverage. And in that stillness, the future of Ducati began to depend on an engine that had not yet turned a single wheel. The tension inside Ducati's garage is no longer hidden behind data screens or polite press statements, because money has a way of stripping away insulation and exposing nerves. Any decision to dramatically raise Marc Márquez's salary would not land softly. It would crash directly into the fragile mental ecosystem surrounding Pecco Bagnaia. Bagnaia is not a rider short on talent or trophies, yet 2025 has hollowed him in quieter ways, through comparison rather than failure. Watching Marquez extract lap time from a compromised GP25 has been psychologically corrosive. Former insiders describe it as seeing someone play the same instrument while ignoring its broken strings, a metaphor that captures the helplessness spreading through the garage. A little-known technical detail deepens the wound. Marquez runs a more aggressive front-load distribution under braking, accepting instability that Bagnaia has never been comfortable managing. The data proves it, and data never lies kindly. Why does it look easy for him and heavy for me? Bagnaia thinks, even when he forces a smile for the cameras. Ducati has always sold internal parity as a virtue, a promise that both sides of the garage compete on equal ground. That promise fractures the moment one rider is paid like an emperor and the other like a lieutenant. If Marc gets that money, the hierarchy becomes official, one former team figure said quietly, the quote carrying more weight than any press release. Bagnaia's confidence, already shaken, risks collapsing under the confirmation that excellence is no longer enough. The garage becomes divided not by contracts, but by perception. Equality breeds cooperation. Meritocracy breeds resentment when it is too visibly rewarded. Ducati now stands between two philosophies it once balanced effortlessly. The sound inside the box changes when belief drains away, even if the engines remain loud. Bagnaia's struggle is not mechanical anymore. It is existential. The tension feels like a perfectly aligned chain stretched one tooth too far. Every lap Marquez wins deepens the fracture. And in that silent split, Ducati risks losing more than harmony. It risks losing its soul. The most decisive pressure on Marc Márquez's future does not come from the pit lane, but from offices far removed from racing suits and tire warmers. Above Ducati course looms Audi, silent, analytical, and increasingly cautious after a bruising 2024 that reshaped priorities across the group. Losses triggered a recalibration, and racing, once protected by prestige, was suddenly measured in margins and forecasts. For Ducati, this changed everything. Marquez's contract stopped being a sporting discussion and became a corporate equation. A little-known internal adjustment tells the story clearly. Audi quietly imposed tighter cost caps on non-automotive R&D, indirectly squeezing MotoGP engine development budgets and, by extension, rider salaries. In that climate, a €15 million request sounds less like ambition and more like defiance. They want victories, but they fear the price of them, Marquez reflects, aware that his value exists in a system now allergic to excess. Inside Ducati, managers find themselves caught between loyalty to a champion and accountability to shareholders. "We don't decide alone anymore," admitted one executive, a quote that revealed how far authority had shifted upward. Audi's shadow stretches long, turning emotional decisions into risk assessments. The irony is brutal. Ducati has never been stronger on track, yet never more constrained off it. Every euro promised to Marquez must now justify itself beyond lap times and trophies. The boardroom sees branding curves, global reach, and amortized value, not knee-down saves or damaged tires. For Marquez, this creates an unfamiliar vulnerability. He is indispensable to Ducati's success, yet optional on a balance sheet. The situation feels like a finely tuned engine, starved of fuel by accountants rather than engineers. Time works against Ducati, because hesitation reads as weakness. Audi's caution may be rational, but racing rarely rewards rational fear. And if the numbers do not align, the greatest rider of his generation could be lost not to rivals, but to spreadsheets. Honda's presence is not loud yet, but it is constant, like a low hum beneath the paddock noise that only a few can hear clearly. As MotoGP edges toward the 2027 regulation reset, Honda's quiet resurgence reshapes every calculation Marc Márquez makes. The clean sheet engine rules promise a rebirth, erasing current hierarchies and rewarding those willing to start again. For Márquez, the idea carries emotional gravity that no spreadsheet can measure. Honda is not just another manufacturer. It is the place where his legend was forged, fractured, and immortalized. A little-known technical detail fuels the temptation. Honda's prototype engine is rumored to be experimenting with a radically narrower V-angle, prioritizing mechanical grip over peak horsepower for the next era. That philosophy speaks directly to Marquez's instincts. If I'm going to build something again, it has to matter, he thinks, replaying memories of titles won and bones broken in red leathers. Ducati understands the danger perfectly. They know that no salary negotiation exists in a vacuum when mythology enters the room. Honda would give him the keys to the kingdom, a senior paddock source said quietly, the quote hanging heavy with implication. For Marquez, the return would not be a retreat, but a reinvention. It would be a story shaped like a circle, closing where it first began. The leverage lies in that narrative power, not just in lap times. Ducati can offer speed and trophies. Honda can offer legacy and authorship. The choice feels like standing between two mirrors, each reflecting a different version of the same man. Honda waits patiently, confident that time and regulations are allies. Ducati feels the pressure because they know how rare such stories are. The possibility alone destabilizes negotiations. And as the future approaches, the myth grows louder than any contract clause.